So we're now recording the session, and what we're now looking at is the Cobie extension. It's in a beta version. We're going to run the beta, as far as I know, through to the 16th of January, at which point then it will be issued out unless there's any kind of glaring problems or issues with the way it's been written. There are some changes that need to be made already, but if you can identify any more, that would be great. It's really about not training you on Solibri here or anything to do with Solibri. It's to do about telling you how the workflow is set up within the Cobie extension. The thing with the Cobie extension is it is completely open to how you might want to use it or configure it and use your own rules, that type of thing. So what I've done is I've set it up with a template of a singular way of using the actual solution. It doesn't mean to say you have to stick to that method. You can manipulate what I've given you and move it forward there. What I've tried to do is look at the two main key authoring tools, and I will include further ones as we go down the line. So I've made it available initially for Revit and ArchiCAD for the architectural based tools, and it's configured for those tools at the start for the facility and information, which is part of the architectural model anyway. So the other models would work fine if you introduce them into the workflow later on. So that's how it's set up. It's set up as a template, and what we're going to go through is the way that I've set the template up, but you'll be able to configure it and do what you want to do with it at any point in time anyway. So we'll go over to the next slide here, and what we're going to look at is these kind of items in the list. So we're going to look at roles first of all, and what I've created with roles. Look at the models that we're going to load in, and it's a little bit different here in a typical scenario for creating a Cobie output to what I would normally show you, because I'm going to try and show you the differences between Revit and ArchiCAD. And it's not really Revit and ArchiCAD; it's between Revit and where the data should exist in IFC. So let's look at the roles first of all. So I'll go across to the Solibri interface. And what I've done is I've set up in this interface a number of, I've set up two roles, one for Cobie Uniclass 1.4 and one for Cobie Uniclass 2.0, which are the classification systems in the UK. Okay, so, and I know that the states are obviously creating their own version of this with the Omniclass codes in as well. So what we've actually got here is on the rule sets, we've got a singular CIC stage based check for checking all of the data requirements throughout the model. And then underneath that, we have initially the architectural BIM validation set, which is the default one inside Solibri. Again, you may need to configure it or do things with it. And this checks obviously the intersections between architectural components. As the project progresses, and you obviously include the different consultants to documents or components into the model, then obviously you can run the BIM coordination-based rule sets that are come from Solibri. And again, I've left those as default, so you might want to configure those and change them to how you actually run them in your own offices. As far as the classifications are concerned, we've got three main classifications at the top here, which we'll go into in more detail, which actually are configurations for the rules. And then we have also these here, which actually relate to the fields that are in the Cobie spreadsheet. So where we can get data from the same location, as in it's a component, not crossed between certain areas in the model, we can actually access it directly using a classification, which gives us the flexibility that if you introduce another modeling system that puts the data in a different location, then at least we can go and grab it, and it doesn't require a user to change the rules to check that data either. And then obviously we've got some takeoff definitions that we've included. So I've created those for Cobie 1.4 and version 2, and they're added to the resources when you install the Cobie add-on. So if I say open here, you can still access all the file-based type ones, and obviously your recent list, but also actually it adds it into a resources area for the add-on itself. So in this case here, we've got a Cobie Uniclass version 2 as well. And if I open that, it's pretty much the same, other than the fact that we're now checking a different criteria. And the only real difference as far as the criteria is for those tabs which have a classification. So the spaces, the facilities, systems and I'm trying to think what the other one is. Anyway, the relevant items on the pick list that need to actually be referred against. So that's really the roles that are set up in there. And so I'm going to leave it on the Uniclass 2 version here, even though Uniclass 2 isn't released and there's still changes that are happening and things like that. One word of note, the Uniclass 2 version here needs to be updated with the classifications. The CPIC website has a different version of as it's been improved basically since this was created. It was created for the Cobie trials, and the template that was created was also created for the Cobie trials. We have a customer in the UK who is currently being asked to generate a Cobie Uniclass 2 deliverable by the client rather than a 1.4 version, and we're in discussion as far as with Nick Nisbet to generate another template file in order that can be actually released. So, but I think until the Uniclass 2 is sort of sort of has a physical release and it's all ready to go, that won't actually occur. So use it as a sort of template in order to understand. And the 1.4 one is the one that you should probably be using unless the client's decided that it should be Uniclass 2 or the project dictates it. Future-proofing wise, Uniclass 2 would probably be the better method, but obviously we need to be a bit careful as far as conformance. If we go over to the models area, so I'm going to go to my recent models. If I'm starting this project now, so the next item in the list was actually loading models up, and just a note here that actually I'm loading 2 architectural models. So what I've got is I've got a Revit architectural mapping file, which is an architectural file. I've got an SMC building, which is an updated version of the one that's included within Solibri. And there's a HVAC file, which is just a ventilation file, which is the same one that was released with Solibri from, I think it was originally created in another piece of software, but I've generated it directly from Revit, so that actually we can see how that behaves as well. So I'm going to select those 3 files. Now, usually you wouldn't have 2 files dictating the facility, which would be the architectural files. What I'm doing here is showing you basically that the data will work both through an ArchiCAD and a Revit sort of based architectural model that may have initiated the process. So if we open those models up and pull them in, the Revit model is really basic. It's just a box basically in the screen, as you can see. And what I'm going to do is just change the HVAC Cobie to building services. So we've got our different models here, our Revit model, our ArchiCAD model, which is the SMC building model, and a HVAC model, which is done in Revit as well, Revit MEP. So I can say OK to that. And the reason for showing this is that we've done quite a improved sort of rule set than what was released with the first version. So let's just go back to the classification. So we've created some classifications, and it might seem a bit strange first of all, but it's very easy to map data to the relevant fields in the final output. What's difficult then is that we need to make sure that the data in those fields is correct. And although we can actually specify where that data comes from and map it automatically, when it comes to checking it in rules, we need to know whether or not the model's been created in ArchiCAD or it's been created in Revit. And it's not, as I said, it's not probably real reason for ArchiCAD. It's just IFC based. So some of the definitions for where we've written ArchiCAD in will be changed to sort of IFC compliant or Cobie compliant, probably Cobie compliant models. So what I'm saying here is that in order for us to find data and check it across models that don't support the Cobie compliant sort of locations, we have to sort of tell Solibri to look for the data in a different area in the rule. So in this instance, there's 3 examples there. So you can see it says the facility data. So when we're looking at facility data, such as the building name and the building description, that should be based at the building level in the IFC tree. And Revit gives it in that location, and so does ArchiCAD, and any Cobie compliant sort of data should put it at the building level. But Revit also creates its own fields to actually store this information. So rather than just putting it in the building name, they'll put it into data facility name. and that means obviously you've got to map those different locations. The project data, so the project data should be stored in a Cobie compliant sort of mechanism under the project area under the IFC tree, yet Revit again stores it under the building area. So that causes us a problem between the containers in IFC and the fact that they're not storing the data in the right location. And the same goes with the site. So again, accessing the site information should be within the site location within the IFC tree, not within the building area. So I perceive that things like Bentley and Vectorworks and some of the other applications, hopefully we can work with them to put their data in the right locations. If not, then we'll just have to extend the rule sets to just include those different locations. It's not really a huge problem, but it's just something we need to be aware of. So let's go across to those classifications, just show you that what they are. So we need to do this before we start so that we can check the architectural based information. So such as, let's check the facility, the floors, the spaces, and the zones that would possibly come from the architectural model rather than any others, especially for the earlier Cobie deliverables. So if we go across now and look at the information takeoff, you'll see that those classifications are all in the list here for the relevant different fields that need to go out to the Cobie spreadsheet. But the top sort of four are slightly different in the fact that what they are is they're containers to actually make sure that the data goes to the right locations. So if we look at, you will see that we've got models and we've got model components. Really, the model components, if I select it, will mean that if I go into the configuration, means that if we have any kind of component and we want to check it, and we want to check its location, basically, it would be ideal to know whether it's come from Revit or ArchiCAD or whatever. And again, this is where we will probably change the ArchiCAD to just Cobie compliant. And if it's Cobie compliant, it means that we don't have to write the rules for every other sort of type of application or specify where it's going to look for it. So in here, the first thing we would do is for the three different models we've got loaded, we would specify, so for the architectural mapping one here, which is the Revit model, we would specify it's a Revit file. And then if we go to the SMC building, we know that's an ArchiCAD model. And we know that the final one, which is the HVAC one, basically is a Revit-based model. And the idea behind that is that once we've set that up and we say, okay, it means that when we use them in rules, we know that anything that comes in this area here, it comes from ArchiCAD or Cobie compliant, and anything here comes from Revit. So we can see that when we're trying to grab the data, we know where it's coming from, and we've already isolated the differences between those. Now, we talked a second ago on the PowerPoint presentation about these containers, and they're labeled as containers in Solibri Model Checker, and these define the building, the project, and the site, and things like the zones and the systems and that type of thing. So again, we would do exactly the same in here, and we would set up the classification in the same way so that we could actually access the containers for those relevant elements. Now, I haven't obviously got one in here that says ArchiCAD, which I should have, and it should be in that list, so we need to fix that. And it would probably be Cobie compliant rather than ArchiCAD, as I've said before. So in this case here, we've got the different containers within the project. So the building, the floor, the project, the site, and the zone. And again, a replicated amount for another model. Obviously, we've got 3 models in here, so I'll just add some more in a second. So if I go into the list, here's the architectural Revit model. So we just go and select the model for each of those container fields. And so we've got them for the container fields. We'll just change the name now to Revit. And then in this one here, then we'll select the SMC building, and you just go down. So this is our ArchiCAD model, and you go down to there, and SMC building. You notice that there's no HVAC listing on the zone one, so because they're not in the HVAC model. So if I go to this one's ArchiCAD, and what I would do is add a few more in here. So we'll just add 4 or 5. So we'll say this one's the building, this one's the floor, this one's the project, and this one's the site. And in this one here, we would just pick the last one, which is the HVAC model. And this would mean that obviously we can then go and get data from those different areas in the model. So this one then wouldn't be ArchiCAD, it's a Revit model. Okay, so what we've now done is we've specified all the containers so that we can see, so if we use them in a rule, we can actually check the data from those different locations. And again, you'll see that it's split the models out as you'd expect between those different areas. When it comes to the zones are a bit of a strange one. If you create the zones in a product that supports proper IFC classification for zones, then it will create a true IFC classification. So in this list down here, if I scroll down, you'll see there will be one called zone type here, and it's actually created the classifications that you'd expect to see for the items in this case in the ArchiCAD model, which is fine, and it's done a good job of that. But actually, from Revit, although we can actually create a true zone, it doesn't actually create a classification for the pick list correctly. So in Revit, you have to create a parameter called zone name. They have created, using the Cobie add-on, a really very good interface for dragging and dropping zones into a hierarchical IFC zone tree, which looks absolutely fantastic, and you can see the representation in 3D. But they haven't connected it to the IFC-based export. So what it's used for is just generating the Excel-based output. If they connect it up to the IFC side, then we don't have to do this part either, because it means they'll export true IFC classifications as well. But in this case, they're not doing that in the same way. So what we need to do is specify whether or not the classification is either applied at the top of the hierarchical tree for the actual the zone name itself. So you have spaces which are then grouped into, which can be dragged into zone names, and each zone name should only have one classification. And the classification, unfortunately, again in Revit, is applied at the space level because it's not available to apply at the IFC base level. Even though, again, in the add-on, they give you that kind of functionality, but it just won't export. So again, the zone category rule, what we'll do is open that up, and in here, what we're actually saying is that if actually Revit ever supported it correctly, you can actually export to the zone type, which is the same name as the column in the pick list for the name for the classification name. If they created it correctly, actually this should actually not be space classification; it should be IFC classified. So if it does find a proper zone type, it should be IFC classified. Where it does actually put the data is in a field called zone classification code. And that can so you've got zone name. You can have zone name 1, zone name 2, zone name 3, which are applied to spaces, which create the zone names themselves. And then you have zone classification code, which is another parameter that you can apply to each space. And then you also have one called zone description. And they all work slightly. They're special fields in parameters inside Revit, which give certain functionality. So the zone name and the zone description export out correctly and will drive the functionality in the right way. The zone classification code doesn't seem to quite work yet, so I've got to have a word with Angel at Autodesk to see if we can sort that out. So, in this case here, what I need to know is whether or not the data is generated from a Revit model is the classification from a zone, or a space or not. So in this case here, what we're actually doing is saying in the Revit model, this one here, what we're saying, if it has a zone classification, a true value, then it's classified as a space. So it's got a space classification. If not, what we'll do is select it from here. We'll say if it hasn't got that and it just picks up on the name of the space because it hasn't got anything else, then it's not classified. And we would do the same for the architectural model, but in the ArchiCAD model, because they do it correctly and they put it in the right place and it supports IFC tree, the IFC tree functionality. What we're actually got here is it's linked to the zone type, and that's actually that true classification. So it'll say it's IFC classified, and then no classification. So again, you would only really need to do this once. I'm only having to do 2 lots here because I've got 2 models that have different zones in it, basically. So you would configure this once with only 1 set of models, so that actually it would go through and you'd put them to the top of the list, basically, for the model type you actually got. So you don't have to do this for every model because this is only really for the model that contains the zones. So we can click on OK to that now, and the bottom 2 can disappear, really. We don't need those in there anyway, so we'll get rid of those. and we can say OK to that list. So what we've got now is Ifc Classified Zones. So when I select them, you can see in the model that these are all the spaces that have a IFC-based classified zone attached to them. Whereas these ones are the space ones, and you can see that these are the Revit models here, and you can see eventually it finds one that doesn't have a classification as well. So it can be used in the checking sort of mechanism. So that's our sort of very basic sort of setup that you would probably have to do just once on the model in order then to make sure that the rules actually function okay. So once we've done that, let's go back to our items that we're going to run through here. The next one is a to-do list item. So you're all aware of the to-do list item, which can be applied to rules and can be applied to ITO, information takeoff, so that it tells you must check this or you must do that kind of thing. Well, what we've done is we've set up a number of to-do list items. So first one is tell us which is the architectural modelling system you're using. Is it Revit or is it ArchiCAD? And again, we'll change it to Cobie compliant. And then if there's any that are outside the Cobie compliant, it will end up being their actual names. We've also set up some rule sets, the rule set CIC stages, and we've done that with the whole sort of set of rules have been set up using gatekeeper rules, which were introduced in version 9, which pass parameters from one rule to another. And we've also got user input methods in there so that we can actually, one, specify which is the architectural modelling system, and two, which is the current CIC stage that we're checking the data for. Okay, so and the rules obviously use the user input as far as where the data is coming from which container, so and the information that's there. So let's show how that's set up. So if we go over to the checking area, you notice we've got our to-do list here, and you'll also see that we've got our number of basic sort of rules that are set up. So the top one says basically CIC stage rules. And you'll see that if we open it up, it's got a number of different sort of stages that are loaded in. What you can do is you can specify which stage you're currently creating the data for. So as I select this and I've set it to level 1, it will show all the levels prior to it. So if I was doing for Cobie CIC stage 3, what it will do now is it will actually drop down the list and give me all the checks that I actually need to do in order to conform for that relevant stage in the project. So for the type required, it's asking me what kind of information that I should be actually checking. So what it does do also is it gives you the ability. So yes, we could load in additional rule sets and folders, and by loading in the additional, so we could have each of these stages as a separate sort of rule set which we loaded in. The issue is that there's no way of then forward checking the data. So the idea behind what we're trying to achieve here is that you could set it to say stage 3, which is what I've got it set at now. Check the data in the model and say, actually, I'm conforming to the data standards that we need to produce at a certain deadline in the near future. But then you could also then check to say, actually, I want to check to see how future-proof my model is, and say, okay, at stage 6, then I want to see is how far are we actually achieving our goals for the future. Now, it does enable you to then save the slides, to communicate with the relevant consultants to make sure that they're actually adding that kind of data and improving their models. And it means that you can save them to the communication area. The great part about it is that actually you can then reset this back to stage 3, and it doesn't lose the association on those slides. So as soon as you put it back to 6 again, then you'll be able to see the relationships between the slides. Otherwise, if you remove a rule set, then you orphan off the communication slides that were there. So it has no connection back to the original issue. So it's quite important to keep that sort of flowing, and that's what we've done there with the rule sets using a user input functionality. And we've done the same with the architectural authoring software. And again, we've got which software you actually used, which is ArchiCAD or Revit. So we'll stick it to Revit first of all and say OK. And what that does, that drives the rules as far as how the information is being shown on screen. So here we have basically a sort of Revit base check. So if I go to stage 0 and I go to the facility, in the Revit area, building name should exist. So let me just show you how that works. So if I right click here and go to the rule parameters, the rule parameters basically say we're checking buildings that are of architectural models, And the user input basically that we're using is what we've just typed. We just clicked on now, say which model type we're using, which is Revit. And then what we're looking at is models that actually been defined from Revit, which is our components basically and our data. So down here, what we've got is the exact location. So it says data Cobie facility name. So this is where it's looking for the facility name within the interface. If I change my architectural authoring software to ArchiCAD and say OK, and then go and select the ArchiCAD area, you can see here now the discipline is architectural, but it's now looking at the ArchiCAD location, and the requirements is now looking for building name. So it's looking at a completely different location. So it won't go and check any other location. It will just check those key areas for those properties. So the rules are set up like that, where we're looking for data in sort of the data drop one, which is the CIC stage 1 here, and where we're only interested to information up to zones, they should really come from the architectural model. So what we're doing here is specifying which architectural modeling system you've used in order then to move that forward. So that's what actually happens. Where we can actually have a situation where the data is at the same sort of container level, so at models level, at the model components level or something like that, what we'll have is, so for something like asset type here, where we're looking for the asset type, then basically we don't need that functionality to say, okay, does it come from whatever model? Because this is a piece of information that comes in at the later stages, which could come from any model. And actually the data normally is associated with the actual model components. So in this case here, what we've actually linked it to is our classification that I showed you earlier. There's a whole list of classifications. And the reason for doing it this way and actually adding it as a classification, it means that somebody can edit the classification without editing the rule. So the rule will work all the time, and you will then edit the classification for the default locations from the different authoring systems. So what we're actually doing in the rule is just saying actually it must be a fixed or movable, and it can't be anything to do with null or whatever. So what we're actually doing here is just putting a requirement against that field basically, and we're saying that it obviously won't relate to spaces, openings, members, plates, that type of thing. So it'll only do the true components that we're meant to be looking at within the type sheet. Okay, so that's done across the board with some of the other rules. So when I select another rule here, you can see that it's just checking the warranty duration unit out, which is a classification. And the basis behind it is that then when we create our information takeoffs, which drive the Cobie output, the information takeoff basically relates to the classification. It takes the values from the classification. So what we're doing is using the rules to check the data in the classification is correct. And then if it's correct, then we use the classification to actually fill the values into the spreadsheets, or into the sheet itself. So that's really the way the rules are set up, and you should run through them and see how that behaves. As you say, when you click between the different types, it then goes away and actually switches the authoring tools and things like that. So let's go back to our list of items to look at. So as you can see here, we've done these parts here. We've got one situation where, because zones, and this is again a Revit issue here, and we discussed this item at the top here, where to do with the zones in the essential classifications, and I'll just go back to it now. So we discussed the classification where it can actually be applied to, this one here can be applied to either a space or actually a proper IFC classification. Because you can actually have a space classification, and you can have a situation where you can have a zone name applied to it. So you can put a number of spaces into a zone, and a space can be a part of a number of zones, which is fine. And but the situation is the zone name should only have one classification applied to it. Okay, now because we're applying that data to spaces in a Revit model manually, and we're actually saying this is this classification, then there is a possibility that somebody could put more than one classification against different spaces that are in the same zone. So, for instance, let me give you an example of this. So, what we've done is in the rule it says you go and check, if you're using a Revit model, go and check this information takeoff, which is called zone category check. And the zone category check just lists the data zone name, which is where you would put the data in for the zone name itself, the data zone classification code, which is what we're expecting to look for, and the count of these elements. But that's default. It's just these two here we're interested in. So if we do take off all now, what it does then is it obviously goes away and it shows us ones that actually are not. So first of all, we've got 61 elements that haven't got a classification applied to a space, which is because they may either, if they've come from a Revit model, they haven't been applied a classification, or it may be that they come from a model that actually supports true IFC classifications anyway. What's very apparent here is when we look at the list, you've got this circulation, Revit circulation zone, which is the name of the zone, and then we have the ones from the pick list in the Cobie sheet, and it says circulation zone and occupancy zone. So the circulation zone and occupancy zone, you can see here straight away we've got an illegal situation where we can't physically have two classification names applied to one zone name. So this one's correct. So as we click on it, you can see that both of these spaces inside Revit have been assigned one classification. Yet these ones have been applied. So this one has been applied maybe circulation zone, and this one's been applied occupancy zone. Well, because they're in the same name, which is Revit zone circulation, they should definitely not have two different types of classification codes. So it gives you a very quick way of seeing the information in this area here. You may have to, if you end up with different zone names for different spaces, because you can have data zone name 1, 2, 3. You just have to add another few columns, obviously, for the additional zone name 1, zone name 2, zone name 3 if you need to. It just depends on how complex you actually have and what level of structure of zones you actually have in your model. But this will give you an indication of whether or not it's failing or not. And then we've set a manual rule. There's a manual rule in the system that says go and check it. So you manually go and check it here, and then you accept the results of the rule basically when you run it. So if we go and have a look at this, so if we go to the CIC, so the authoring tool, and we set it to Revit and say OK, and then we go to our checking area and hit the check button, it should run through those checks. And actually, when we go down the checks and look for zones, the first one said it should have a classification. So one of these items says check the zone classification code is consistent. So down here, it explains basically what you should go away and do and actually check it. And you should go into the information takeoff, check this situation like this, and then see whether or not there is a problem or not. And I think I've got an issue with my screen at the moment. There we go. Okay. So yeah, so you can check this, and in this case here, it's failed. So we'd have to go back to the relevant consultant and actually get those these zones here fixed. At least it will show you the ones that actually have the mixed use, and then you can go and drill in and actually look at where it's gone wrong. So that's really sort of some of the key checks, and you can see the way that the actual rules are actually looking for the problems in that list. So there's a whole host of those that you should have a look and go through and see the kind of functionality that's based in them. Okay, once we're happy that we've let's just go back to our list again now. So then we go into our Cobie settings. So the real key thing is that yes, we can use the Cobie add-on in it, and the Cobie add-on in the spreadsheet format is a really good way of looking at the data as well. But actually, we should never sort of create the final output until we've fixed all these issues. So the first pass is really to go down this list. I do tend to use the Cobie interface to give me an appreciation on the data itself. So if we go to the Cobie area, the first thing we need to do in the Cobie area is load the Cobie settings. And the Cobie settings define which ITOs and the standard settings in the interface as far as what it's going to go and check and which ITOs it's going to use to strip the data out of the model. So if we go to the Cobie settings, again, we've provided two templates, one the 1.4 and one version 2. I'm going to use the 2 one today because my models contain version 2 sort of classifications, so it won't look so empty in the sheets. So if I say OK to this and say open, it opens the classification settings. Well, actually, it loads in the template, but that's used for that. And if we click on the settings over here for that template, you can see This is the Cobie template that will be used, and obviously we can replace this when we get newer versions of it. And then what we have is a number of different tabs, which are the tabs inside the Cobie spreadsheet. Each one of those tabs has a separate ITO which actually fills the data within it. In this case here, the attribute and the coordinate information is filled automatically, so it's actually populated automatically. I'm not going to use those at this stage. I'm saying do not fill. And the reason why I don't fill them at this stage is that while I'm checking data, I don't want to be in a situation where I'm waiting for it to calculate these extra fields. So, for instance, if we were doing our calculation for the initial Cobie drop, then we would not need the component, the type, and the system and the assembly data being shown, just these ones here. So you could then turn these to say do not fill. And then you can include them later as you then generate those relevant data drops. We could save different stages for each of these, but actually, again, what you want to do is if you assign different ITOs to these and you configure this interface, you don't really want to be redoing it again. So it's easier just to flick these switches on and off as far as which sheets you want to generate at the right time. Once I've done that, so these are what are going to get loaded into the system. If I say OK to that and I click on the calculate button, and yes, it's going to warn me of all manner of different things because I haven't done them yet. So I'm going to say calculate anyway, and it'll go away and calculate the data in the model. So it'll populate the information in the actual in the interface here. The interface here, although it looks like a spreadsheet, it's not. The data in here is actually is coded. It's a coded system. So when we need to just pump out the data to XML, we will be able to do it relatively quickly rather than going out to a spreadsheet. So we've just made it look like a spreadsheet here, so it looks like what we've got to deliver. Okay, so what we've got down here then is when we click the calculate button, it loads all the sheets up for us. So what we have is a correlation between the facility sheet, for instance, and the facility sheet on the interface here. By default, the ITO doesn't get loaded onto this tab, the Cobie tab. So you might have to include it by clicking on the field here. And then you can drag and drop it in, and you can use it then to configure the way that the system works. Now, we've discussed a little bit about classifications, and let me just go to, say, the type sheet first of all, and I'll look at the type area here. Now, where we get to asset type here, this is a field that we need to fill in. The way that the ITO works is as long as the name is exactly the same as the one in the actual sheet over here, the asset type here, then the data will populate it. Now, we have a choice basically in the Cobie sheets basically to define whether or not how this actually gets generated. So we could have for each different model a number of these fields all called asset type which point to different locations. So what I've done here is if I double click here, the actual field points at a classification called Cobie type asset type. So in this sense here, what it's doing is it's looking at the classification for the values rather than pointing at a definite place. I could point it to the property set where it's located inside ArchiCAD, and I could create another one which would point at the property set which is located for Revit, and another one for Tekla, and another one for whatever it would be, basically any other application where they put the data. Hopefully they start putting in the data in the right location for the responsibility matrix. Then it makes it easy. We don't have to have lots of columns. I've alleviated the situation of not actually having the additional columns by using a classification instead. It means that the user can go to the classification down here. So if we go and find the type and asset type here, it means they can open the settings up, and the settings basically say, okay, if I'm looking for the ArchiCAD mapping, I can double click here and it's going to look for the information in the Cobie asset, and this is the property set name, and this is the property name that it's going to grab it from, asset type. So if it finds a valid value, then we use the value out of column 2, which is this one here. The rules will then check to see whether this asset type says fixed or movable, and make sure it hasn't got anything else in it, and tell you when it's got not applicable in it and that type of thing. So it will give you a complete breakdown of when it fails, and again, you should make sure your rules are run before you generate your sheets and you correct everything. And the Revit location here, if I double click, actually points at a folder called data, which is the location they use for their Cobie add-on at the current moment. and what we've got is a property name called Cobie.type.asset-type. This is the field that it generates inside Revit for you to put that data in. And then what we've also got down the bottom here is a catch basket. Now this is something that we need to start working on as far as, and again, this is beta software. This is another thought process on how we deal with it. So at certain stages of the CIC stages and the certain deliverables, the data drops, you have the choice basically whether or not you include data that you've filled in or not. So even though you might you could actually reveal data that actually is not required for that stage at this point in time. So you're actually providing data ahead of schedule. Now, I've had discussions with people where they say actually that would confuse people, and what we really want to do is just put not applicable in there instead. So theoretically, what you could do is have a whole set of these that you load up for the different stages. So you could call them the same thing and have a whole folder full of them, and say actually, well, when I'm at that stage, I'll load another set of classifications. And in that set, then basically I'll set them all to not applicable because I don't want any value in that field at that stage of the process. We've set it so that that it actually shows the values, but it's relatively easy if you wanted to do that. So, for instance, you just copy all and then just change the values in them and save them as another set. But the way it's working at the moment is it's going to check the ArchiCAD mapping, and if it finds a value, it uses column 2. If not, it uses column 3, which is this Revit location. Then anything that it hasn't got any other kind of description in at all, it just gives it not applicable. Okay, so it would be, if it's not defining those two locations, this is what will be put in the cell. So it doesn't say unclassified, or it doesn't say anything else. It says the correct value for what should be in the responsibility matrix for that field, if there isn't a value. So that's how we've set all of those kind of systems up, basically, so they point to the right location. It does mean that if I've got Bentley in here and I've got Vectorworks, all I have to do is literally right click and add a new column in, and then specify the location of where that data would exist within that piece of software. So and I'm going to run through the Bentley one very shortly, and I'm going to do the Vectorworks one as well. So this template will improve over time. So we should all work together to improve where we find issues with it, and whether or not you feel it's the right way to go forward with the way it works. So feedback's really crucial as to what we've done already. So once we've done the mapping there, if we go back to the facility, so the contact tab is one that is one we've got to do some work on. We're in the process of specifying exactly what we're going to get out of it. The issue is that some of the data here is not exported correctly, especially from Revit. So we need ways of obviously getting the data into the sheet. The data, the minimum will be the data from the different model authors. The key thing here with this sheet is not really the data that comes from the model authors. It's the data that comes from the relevant components, and it's how we backdate that data into this sheet, basically, which is the specification we're working on. For each model, there'll be a line, and it is only literally a few seconds job to be able to do that. You can export the actual sheet out and then complete it and then pull it back in again, and it will display correctly inside Solibri anyway. And then we need a way of populating the additional data. The rest of the sheets are pretty good. So if we go to the facility sheet, you can see that it's filling all the data in correctly. We've got project name, site name, and I've put the fields into these template models to actually make sure that what I'm actually seeing here is the same as the actual name of the columns, basically. And you can see that it pulls across the site description, the facility, and everything else. If I drop this down, we've done some different things to do with the facility sheet due to the fact that of where to get data and the complexities of it. So if it actually puts the data in the correct location, it's again a Cobie compliant basic location, as in the responsibility matrix. What we've done, so for project name, for instance, if I double click on the project name here, what we've done is we've written a script. So we've JavaScripted this field. So when you get your versions, you'll see this column here, but you won't be able to double click on it, and you won't be able to see what's in it, basically, because that part won't be available to you in your interface, really. So this, if it's in the right location, it grabs it from here. You'll notice that we've got another one here which says project name, because this is not actually picking it up, and we haven't scripted it for every different type of application, because it would be harder work to do that. What we've done is added another column here called project name. So this is the odd occasion where we've got two field names the same. So this is our location for where it's grabbing it from Revit, which is the data Cobie facility project name. And this is the value where it's grabbing it from the the JavaScript, basically, which just picks it up from different areas. And we've done that across the site name as well, because you can see we've got a default site name here, which is placed in the standard location for that information, which we don't want to use. We want to use the site name. So it's particularly important that our JavaScript fields, which get the data from where it should be placed, are sort of at the end of the list, if you're with me. So it's going to grab the data from the first column it finds. So in this case here, the site name is picked up from the Revit location, and it ignores the default one. So what we end up with in the site name is the correct value. So here's the site name, rather than it saying default here. So make sure this column's before this one. And that's pretty much it for. We haven't really JavaScripted too many other sort of fields. The rest of them you can add your own columns in and do what you need to do. If we go to the floor tab and we double click on any of the floors, you can see that it actually shows us all the spaces now related to those floors. You're not going to see it in that one very easily. And again, the second floor and the roof. We've worked really, really hard on the generation of the data that's related to the spaces, so the display of information. So if I go to the space here, if we double click on any of these spaces, yes, it's a bi-directional link, so we can use this to access data within the model, and it's a useful tool anyway, just to access data by type and component, that type of thing, to see what people have put in. But we can also sort of highlight multiple elements, and once we select one in the model, so if I select this space on the end here, the interface has an info icon here, and the way that the info icon works is it will identify exactly which line in the current sheet you're on. So if there's no components in the current sheet, it will throw up an error to tell you that actually in the sheet you're currently in, there's no elements that are there. So in this case here, this one would only probably work with the space area. So if we hit the information button, you see it highlights the row in the actual in the spreadsheet. So we've got a bi-directional link there. So you can either double click in the actual model here, or you can actually select something in the model somewhere and find out basically where that exists in the current sheet you're looking at, which is really useful for narrowing down some of the data. You'll see the zones have been created. And again, if you wanted to see the mappings, you just change these to the relevant mappings for now. Now we're looking at the zone information. If I click on some of these areas here, these are our zones we've set up in the other model. So these are general spaces. This is the horizontal circulation. This is the vertical circulation. And you can see even the Revit ones come through if we do them correctly. So I haven't had to manually import this data. It's actually done the zones correctly as true IFC zones. If you use that zone name field, it does it correctly. Again, some of the documentation for that can be found on the download for the IFC exporter, which you can get the free exporters for Revit. They tell you basically there's certain functionality that you can actually apply at each level of those. So check the information on those. If we click on the type sheet, we can see when we double click on any of the types, it shows us those relevant elements in the model. So here's our columns, but the key thing here is look what's happening. It's actually showing us all the spaces that are related to those types. So we've concentrated very carefully on looking at each individual element and which number of spaces actually relate to it. So we want to show the spaces in relationship with the elements. Now, at any time, you can turn off the spaces. So by default, they appear, but you can use obviously Alt-S or the functionality at the top here to turn those spaces on and off. And the key thing with this is that we've generated the sheet based upon all of the information in the ITOs and the calculation. You'll see that you can use this interface here by using the selection basket functionality. And if I hit the equals on that one, I've done a typical thing that you do in Solibri anyway. I've set the selection basket to equal the components. But it means now when I go to calculate, I can either hit calculate here or I can hit calculate selected. And if I hit calculate selected, it will only go away and calculate the model based upon those elements. Now, what's nice about this is that it's gone away and done pretty much the same thing here, but it's now not showing us any other types because we've got that there, But if I move to the component sheet now, what it's now actually showing me is only those components that relate to that type. So rather than working through a whole huge field of this information, if you wanted to check a certain type had got certain data and then each of the components related to it had got the data correct, you could actually do that by just narrowing it down and doing a different calculation. And this is why the rules are great initially to check the data is correct, but it's also a good visual check to make sure that the columns are filled in correctly as well in the sheet. You can actually get that data out. Now, we did quite a convoluted way of fixing some of the issues to do with the type sheet, and there are a couple of functions in the Revit exporter now which actually fix all those issues when they come out. So it's very rare we have to sort of fix any of the types. The only things we probably have to look at, which I haven't checked yet, is the anything that is a wall sweep and whether or not they include the ID on it. But I think they will from the new functionality that's there. So that's the sort of type sheet. So to get everything back, all you need to do is just go back to here and say calculate. So we click on the calculate button, it goes away and calculates and shows us that information. So that's our type sheet. The component sheet, if we go and have a look at the components, again, you notice that it's listing the relevant spaces that are related to those elements. So these columns obviously outside the building, that's why they say not applicable on some of them. But if I go down to, say, the slabs, let's show you the work that we've been doing. So if I go to slab here, so if I go to slab number 3, for instance, here, and I double click, this is a slab which is between one of the stories of the building. But you can see that actually the representation understands every space it's connected to. So it understands that it's actually connected to all those spaces there. So if I go to slab number 4, this particular slab only relates to those 2 spaces. So we're actually showing the correct items that it's related to. And if we look at that in a little bit more depth when we go down to, say, the walls, and I go down to wall number, so we'll just pick wall 41, you can see here that we've got a door which actually spans between these 2 spaces. Now, if we go to 42, which is down the corridor a little bit, you can see that this wall is connected to these spaces here. So the association between elements is been improved massively in Solibri. They've worked really hard to look at associativity of spaces, not just the nearest space. So before we used to use the nearest space, and now it actually picks the exact spaces. So we know exactly what these components are actually related to. Now, the other thing that's in this model, if I go to the SMC building model name here, if I go down the list, and if I actually, we'll just go into the spaces here, you'll notice that in this space areas, you'll find there are some, let's just go to ground floor spaces. You'll notice that in this list here, there are sort of tenancy-based spaces. So this one here basically contains some of the other spaces themselves. So we've got gross areas as well, things like that. So there's ground floor gross area here. And to be quite honest, those items really don't need to be into the spaces sheet here. So what we've done with the spaces sheet is that if we scroll down the classifications, everybody should be aware there's something called space grouping. And the space grouping basically looks at certain key requirements in the specification as far as the type of elements that are in there. So anything that actually is applied as part of this space grouping and becomes a space grouped object, if the space group classification exists, then actually when you run the calculate menu in the Cobie add-on, they won't be part of the list there. So we don't have to worry about combination sort of spaces, that type of thing that you might want to import. Okay, so that's additional functionality on the space area, but it's using the space grouping to actually do that automatically. So if we were to delete this, we'll end up with a load of spaces that had duplicate sort of areas as well, so which is not good. The system does exactly the same as what we were doing before. So if I go to the exhaust air here, you'll notice that the exhaust air is showing basically the system components, and where the component sheet showed the relationship between the component and the space it's actually in, this is now showing the system. So the system knows basically all the components that are in it because it's listing those system components, and it knows the spaces that they're related to. And then the individual components know obviously which space they're related to as well. So all this data is actually now being calculated correctly and shown in the right way inside Solibri. The assembly tab's slightly different, and the assembly tab, if I zoom out on the model, we've got some work to do here still, but it's not work in the sense of fixing issues. We have something called the Cobie assembly components, which is an ITO. And what it does is it looks at the data in the model, but it's actually referencing a Cobie assembly components classification. And the way that it works is that if we open up the classification, is you can see the different types of components inside the model. So we're saying if it's a wall, then the type of classification for the assembly is a material breakdown. If it's a curtain wall, it's an assembly part. If it's assembly, it's assembly part, and so on and so forth. So we can configure the different types of elements in this list to be the different types in here. So this gives us a material sheet breakdown for the different types. So we can say, okay, well, a roof, which is a roof type, this is a material breakdown. Whereas if we go down the list, you can see that we've got none, but we also got, we should have parts in here as well somewhere down the list. Because we should have curtain walls in there. Anyway, if we have a look down the actual completed sheet, what it does is it'll automatically, actually it's only showing us, because I haven't got any of those elements in there because we've got no curtain walls in. The other model I've got had got curtain walls in. So let me just prove that to you. So if we go to the recent models, I knew there was a reason for loading in one of our old clients' models here. So we'll just load in the. Let's just find it a second. Actually, I won't because it's somebody else's model, and I don't want to specify who the customer is, to be honest. So anyway, let's go back. It would actually listing here parts. So what this is doing here is, so for curtain walls, it would list the individual elements, and it would say it was not a layered element. It would say it was a parts element. So here's our 240 walls, and you can see again, even in the classification, what it's actually doing is visualizing the location and the spaces that are related to those walls. So here's an EW1 240, and what it's doing is it's taking the individual composite elements from it. So this is the face brick, and this is the other item from it. So it's the same component, but it's listing the different layers of that assembly element. Obviously, it does require that the element is an IFC wall rather than IFC wall standard case rather than a wall. But there we go. So that's in essence what we're doing. So we're physically linking classifications. So if we just go to the floors or something like that, we're linking these fields to the relevant classifications where we can actually get the data from the same location. So not probably the floor one, but for say something like the component one, all of these serial installation date, warranty date, all exist over here. So we configure them over here in the classification, which means anybody can do it as far as improving the way that it's linking. And then it will dynamically populate the fields for us, and that's really the essence of it. Now, there's a number of other things. So, for instance, if I go into the Cobie settings, you can obviously specify attributes. Now, what we've done with the attributes list is that it was generating data even though the values were 0 or 0. So what we've done is we've taken out even if you've got it in the list here as far as a piece of information or an attribute that you want to list. What we do is we would go down the list, and then once it's actually generating the attribute list, if it's got a null value in or not applicable or anything else, then actually there's no point in putting it in the attribute list. So what we've done is we've taken those out. It reduces the number of attributes hugely in the attribute sheet. We've got a little bit of work to do here as well. The little bit of work here is if you've got a certain component of a certain type, basically, which had a duct width, if you're with me, then, and you got a different type of duct, basically, you might not want to list a parameter for one but not the other. But we're working on that as we speak. And then we've set up some standard exclusions as well. So anything that's got Cobie in shouldn't be in there anyway because it's already exists in the other sheets. Constraints from sort of Revit, anything that's in the data area probably shouldn't exist there because it should be in the other sheets again. Graphics, and then anything that's under other, basically. So other was the old place that they put the Cobie data in for the Revit sort of functionality. We've got created by and created on, so where it's taking the data from the owner history or primary the takeoff column, and then secondary the owner history. So it just specifies where we get that created on and by from. And then the name formats is really used to fix issues to do with certain columns, certain name columns in each sheet. So what you can actually do, for instance, for the wall sweeps that didn't come across before, I'd have to check whether that actually works now. But what you can do is actually create a filter. So you can say which sheet it comes from. So in fact, if we're trying to fix it for the type sheet, but we'd put type here, we'd run the filter functionality and save just those wall sweeps into it. And then what we'd do in the name format here is we'd actually add the name and then add a delimiter. And so we'd add, say, a colon or whatever in here. And then we'd add the ITO column. And the ITO column, then we would go and pick, say, the BAT ID or something from it. So then what we'd actually be doing is concatenating two fields together. So this is a way of fixing data that should be right in the IFC model, but gives us the flexibility to make it the same as what's in the authoring systems if the IFC isn't creating the right information. You pretty much see those things relatively easy, and it's quick to actually sort out anyway. Okay, so that's pretty much the settings in here. The way that the way that you can actually drive the system can be either through the ITOs. So the responsibility matrix contains two tabs called the type and asset tab. So type and component asset tabs. And they list basically the type of elements which should be either included or not included within a Cobie deliverable. To be quite honest, the list is ambiguous and it should be addressed for every project. So in which case then you can then go through and you can specify for the component and type the type of elements that you actually want to be to be actually delivering. So for instance, I could go in here and for the Cobie component, and this is a bit of a silly one, but I could say, and I just want to show it because it's obvious, if I say take out the walls, for instance, and I do the same for the type sheet, and just take out the walls, and remove those and say OK. What I've now got is if I say calculate, is a situation where none of the walls will actually be included into the actual drop. So what you actually see now is that by default we see a representation of what is and what isn't included into the actual deliverable, and that's done by this little icon here. And this little icon basically shows the included components in transparent color and the excluded in solid color, and vice versa the way around. So when I click on it, what it's actually showing me now is these are all the items that basically are excluded. And if I drop this down and say show the included items, these are the included items. So it's very clear what is going to be part of the Cobie drop or not. Now in Revit, they have a functionality where you can actually check a checkbox, and the checkbox basically says these components are actually included. Well, that's really easy. What you do is then just do a filter and then save a selection basket basically on those items. So for instance, in this case here, what I could do is I could set these items to the selection basket. So again, same situation. I'd go to the component sheet here. I'd select all of the items that have been generated now, hit the equals button. Now I've got a selection basket which has got all of these components in here. I'd put the spaces in there as well just to make sure that they're also, so I grab all the spaces and hit the plus button. So now what I've got is pretty much what the ITO was generating minus the walls. And what I could do there is then save that as a selection basket. So if I just hear Cobie, we'll call it Cobie, drop 3 or something, and say OK. So what it does give you the ability to do with the selection basket is it enables you to control exactly what's included or not. So it's a good example in the fact that IFC doesn't have as far-reaching sort of functionality at the moment, and sometimes you have to use the categories in the IFC file to put some different items onto it. So, for instance, there's no drainage elements. So, in an example I've done in previous times, where you've got a drainage component like a rodding point or a rodding access point, inspection chamber, those inspection chambers may end up on something like pipe fittings, and you might not want to display all of the pipe fittings. You might only want to display, so pipe fittings wouldn't normally be included, or pipe lengths wouldn't be included either. The actual flow distribution devices would be, but the pipe fittings wouldn't. So you're in a situation where the list of IFC-based classifications isn't far enough reaching to be able to do it. So what it gives us the ability to do is we can go back into those settings, and I can add back in my walls here. So my wall can be added back in again, and I can go to my component, and I can add the wall back in again here as well. So I've added them to both the component sheet and the type sheet. And now what we can do is, if I hit the calculate button, it's going to calculate it based upon all of the elements, and you'll see the model in the screen shows us exactly what we've actually got, because it's actually listing all of the components in the ITO. But I can drop this down now, and where we had calculate selected before, which enabled us to narrow down the data, we've also now got calculate Cobie drop 3, so we can actually calculate the final output. When we click the report button, which generates the sheet, it won't generate it based upon one where it said calculate selected. It will generate one on the calculate drop, calculated named selection basket. So if I hit the calculate selection basket, this now shows us what's in our ITOs, and if I calculate now, this shows us what's in our in the list here. So we can see straight away the kind of elements that we might want to put in on the model. So if I go back to my type sheet now, and I just do a calculate, a normal calculate, because I want to see those walls, and I might want to include just walls of a certain type. So when I go and click on these items, you can see that it's you can see which walls that I'm selecting. So for instance, if I wanted to include these EW4 100s, then what I could do is, if I hit the plus button here, the plus button will add it to the current selection basket, and you can see the selection basket's changed. And what we would do is just hit the save button now, and by hitting the save button, what we've now got is an ability to take certain components in and out of the Cobie selection. So if I do a calculate, that's our default calculate. And if I do now calculate, if I do calculate this time based upon the Cobie drop 3 and say calculate, it will then now show, as you can see now, the items that I've got listed in that, the items I've just added to it, as well as the initial list. So complete flexibility, whether you're using whatever system you like, whether or not somebody's tagged it in their authoring system or not, as far as whether or not you're generating it from a selection basket or whether you're generating it from the list here. My only advice really is the selection basket is a static view, and you're probably better off creating it from initially from either a classification or a filter, and then hit the update the actual filter each time, so that this model would always show the current version of those elements. So, it's flexible enough for you to do what you need it to do. So let's move over back to the PowerPoint a second now. So we've seen that we've got the Cobie settings, the Cobie data generation, and how we actually carried out the mapping, what we do with spaces and space groups, where we've got spaces which are sort of gross areas, those types of things. You've seen the improved visualization that we've worked on each of the tabs, basically, and you've seen the assembly functionality. The attributes obviously generated automatically, and they can be done literally at any stage then later on by literally just going to the attribute here, fill automatically there, and if we say OK to that and we just do a calculate now, it will then calculate those additional sheets. So now it's doing the attribute sheet. Once we've finished that, and we can then hit the report button, we can create the relevant drops that are required for the information. Moving that on to the stages that obviously towards the construction phases, what you can do is you can create classifications in here, which involve the elements. Now, some of the new components that are in the classification. So if I create a new classification now, you'll notice that it says allow multiple classification names. This has been included so that we could actually have a component that's part of two different work packages, for instance. So it also could be a situation where we've got a classification that has more than one uniclass classification in there, so a common delimited list. And that would give the ability for, because at the current moment with the old sort of version of Solibri, you could only have one one-to-one relationship with. So as soon as you added a classification to a component, it moved out of the list and you couldn't classify it as anything else. So whereas this now gives us the ability to have multiple classifications to the same element, which is useful for work packages, because it means that if you've got an external wall, you might have an internal finish on that wall, but you might have the construction of the wall as well. So it gives us the ability to have those in each of the different baskets. Once you've done that, very much like what we did here with generating the Cobie drop 3 from a selection basket, then what we can do is we can set the selection basket to equal one of the work packages, and then when we calculate based upon the work package, what it will do is it will go away and just actually show you the sheet which is related to that subcontractor, basically, or where you've tendered it out. The situation is when you've reported the Excel spreadsheet, they can go out as those packages. Now, what we have generated is we've generated a portal, a Cobie portal, which will include the main sheet initially, so you can upload the main sheet, and then you can also then upload the individual sheets as work packages. So you get a complete interface which enables you to load in the original sort of main documentation of what's required, and then the individual work packages, and it enables you to assign those work packages to the different subcontractors and track their ability and their completion rates of those work packages themselves. Once it's finished, then obviously we can merge the two sets of data together relatively easily, or export the data out in order that you can import it back into the authoring tools and populate the data there, and do a round trip back into Solibri again for the final handover based Solibri, Cobie handover. So we've got sort of from right away from the start right to the end. So it's kind of you just need to know that Solibri is capable of actually doing the whole sort of end-to-end solution. The last part which I discussed, which is the portal, is actually part of a separate company called AECO Solutions, and will be a paid-for add-on in order to create the Cobie Drop 4 information, or the Cic Stage 6, which is the handover information. So the serial numbers, the warranties, the data related to the components. We have had people that have actually just exported the spreadsheets out from the work packages and got them to fill them in, and then imported them back into the authoring tools and run through. So, but what it does give you is the portal gives the users a very simplistic interface, and doesn't require them to have any software to actually put the data together. So it's sort of a foolproof method of actually doing it. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the interface now, and I've got lots of questions by the look of it. So let's have a look. So the first one from Natasha says, I don't quite understand the difference between the Facilities tab and the horizontal list and the drop-down Facility 2. Why are there two locations? Between the horizontal list and the drop-down Cobie Facility 2. Okay, right, the two different locations. So sorry, this is so I'll just repeat the question. So basically, Natasha, one of the users on the list, has actually asked, they don't understand the difference between why we've got the data at the top here and what's going on at the bottom. In reality, you don't need this data on at the bottom if you're generating the data in that way. The data this is good enough in order for you to look at the information that's actually created. What the ITO does is the information takeoff that we put on here. So if I go to the information takeoff and drag and drop this back in again, what this is actually doing is showing you how the data in this sheet is calculated. So it gives you a mechanism of actually looking at the data in a certain, to make sure that it actually is creating the information correctly. If you're never going to configure it and it gives you what you want in the sheet here, you don't really need to be looking at this. But usually there's the odd mapping that you might need to do, which means that you then go through and actually change one of these values in the sheet. So for instance, here we're looking at the type sheet. This is the component sheet. Let's go to the type sheet. So where we've got this asset type here, if it's mapped to a different location kind of thing, or there's some issues with it, it does give you the ability to go into here and say how it's going to be filled in. The key part is that part there, is that any field that's listed down here in the ITO, as long as this here is the same name as the one in the Cobie spreadsheet, it will try and populate the data with the information that pops down here. And that's really it. It's just literally a correlation between these two pieces of data. But the great part is you don't have to, if you don't have to regenerate the Cobie drop here to see the data that's going on and see what's being filled. So this is really quick at a singular level of generating it just for the type information to see whether or not it's populating the data correctly or not. So you don't have to run the whole Cobie generation. You can just run it from here. You do need to run the Cobie generation once, first of all, in the project, so that actually they exist in here, so that the list is populated, because they don't exist in there initially until the calculation is physically run. So hopefully that answers the question there. We've got another question I'll just read here. Says, will the information button on the Cobie list later on also work with the Solibri model viewer? Very, very good question. I would really like it to work with the viewer, and I'd really like the Cobie interface to be available. So not necessarily being able to map it or generate the data, but actually provide a configured Cobie output which people can interrogate and look at the information and use the information backwards and forwards. So yes, it's on my massive wish list to get that one resolved, so that it's not just a generation tool, but it's also a visual representation for the clients that actually have asked you to generate the data. So it's better than just looking at a spreadsheet or a piece of data. We have then the ability to actually see the components against what's been generated. So yes, that's on my very high on my wish list. So okay, so moving on to the next question now. It says, how far are you in developing the Bentley models? The Bentley models, I've got a file from Volker at Bentley, and it will be a case of just checking the locations for the data, making sure they're putting the data in the right location, and it's actually physically exported from IFC. We'll map what we can relatively quickly, and when we say relatively quickly, it's not a big job now because we've got the whole interface sort of set up. It's just a case of going through, adding a model in that's got all the data in it, and then saying, okay, what's missing, what's not, and then if there's data that's missing, we'll go back to Bentley and we'll get them to fix those areas, and then finish off the mapping. So now that we've finished this part here, what we'll do is we'll increment it and actually add in Bentley and the others. You'll probably find that even now, if you run it, you could then add in extra columns or change the classifications in order to actually find those extra columns. So, for instance, if I go to the asset, again, let's just go to a simple one like the asset one. So if I go to the asset type, and you're in here and you say, actually, well, the Bentley position now, they've placed it somewhere else, so we'll add a new column in, and what we'll do is then we'll specify where the Bentley location is. Now, if I just leave it at that at the moment, it's to the wrong column basically, but it means I can add another column, another line in here, and for Bentley I would specify it's there and then say equal. So as you can say, it's just a case of going down each of those fields and actually setting them up and making sure that they've put their data in the models in the right place. I say I've got a model, and it's my next job to actually run through and make sure the Bentley models actually come in. So to watch this space, I suppose, is the answer. And and I think the only thing that will delay it will be if there's data missing. So as soon as some of those things are fixed, then it should actually be okay. In the meantime, you just won't be able to get some of the data in if it's not there. And then the bottom, it says, can we have a copy of the recording for the presentation? It was quite quick when adjusting the settings. Yes, you can have a copy of the presentation. I did a presentation on Tuesday, which was probably far smaller. Well, it wasn't quite so in depth. So this one's a little bit more in depth than the one I did on Tuesday. So we'll make them both available to you. People in Finland, I'll forward those to them, and they'll get a link out for you to be able to download it and watch it. The next steps are to create documentation, and so there'll be a user guide which is only to show how to push the buttons, and then what I'll do is I'll create some polished versions of these types of movies which explain different concepts, where things are likely to go wrong, how you can get around them, how to generate just the most simpler things, really. So we'll take you through the whole stages, but I'll do them as a number of snapshots so that you can run each individual section rather than actually running a massive movie. But you're quite welcome to the movie that we've got here, which just explains some of the principles and how it works. But the other ones will be a little bit more in depth, and will explain the information a bit better. So that's all the questions I've got in my list. I can only say thank you very much for your time and your attention. And if you can actually push the actual add-on over the next 2 weeks, experiment with it, come back with any feedback as far as things that are not working correctly, Most of the issues will probably be to do with the rules, where there'll be mistakes or things like that, and they're easily corrected. And we'll have a period where we continually update the Cobie add-on as people find things. We'll update the resources. So you need to check from time to time in your solution center area. So, for instance, make a habit of going to your solution center here and checking the Cobie area. And the Cobie area, I mean, we'll send an email out to the relevant people when they've updated it. But if you're in Solibri, it'll actually say update here if we've created an update for it. So as soon as we've found any issues, we'll update them, and it only takes a few hours or a day to actually get an update. So, and then it will be available for everybody to actually have in their versions. So, and that's about all. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day, and goodbye. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.